Now, ahead of World Refugee Day, the UN's refugee agency, UNHCR, has released a report which looks at forced displacement based on the data. And we're looking at, in the annual Global Trends report, the UN Refugee Agency said more than 68 million people were displaced last year in 2017. For more, we're now joined by Markku Aikomus, a UNHCR spokesperson. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, forced displacement, if people voluntarily, well, not voluntarily feel they have to go to Europe, say, from Africa to Europe, is that a forced displacement? Explain what you mean.
Well, forced displacement means people who are forced to flee their countries because conflict, war and persecution. So they have no choice, they need to save their lives and get out of the country.
And you're saying nearly as many people as there are in Thailand last year.
Exactly. I mean, the numbers are staggering, and this is the 5th year in a row that numbers are increasing. And if we put this in the local context, you know, it's much more than the entire population of South Africa. And besides, I mean, they are behind the numbers. These are not just numbers. These are people, you know, mothers, grandmothers, fathers, who are desperately fleeing to save their lives.
Put it into context. In recent years, what were the numbers? How serious has that increase been?
Let's say from the last year, we had an increase of 3 million in the refugee side, and it's been growing from 55 million up to 68.
Okay, so we think of the hotspots, Syria, Yemen, but this is an Africa problem as well. Which are the countries generating this sort of forced displacement? Well,
Africa is a region that hosts most of the forcibly displaced people in the world, including 6.3 million refugees. There's many countries that are producing refugees, but mainly South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, mentioning some.
Okay, and then a lot of the refugees are trying to head to Europe. Is that still the move? But you're also looking at movements within countries.
Absolutely. I mean, this report tells us some of the interesting insight. For example, 85% of the world's refugees are in the developing countries. And that is always the perception in the industrialized countries, that they are flooded with the refugees. But 9 out of the 10 forcibly displaced people are actually in their countries or next door.
Okay, like the Myanmar situation.
Exactly,
yeah.
Yes.
So this has been troubling many world leaders for years. We've seen different responses. We've seen the rise of Donald Trump and his stance. Recently, the boats were not taken in by 2 countries, I think received by Spain, some of those refugees trying to cross the ocean. Has there been a hardening of hearts, do you think?
Well, but it depends. I mean, 2 years ago, 193 member states of the United Nations passed the New York declarations, and they are committed to keep providing protection to refugees, as well as finding more comprehensive ways of assisting not only refugees but also those countries and host communities that are shouldering the most of the burden.
So, but are we acting on those commitments?
They are promising. You know, at the moment, there's 14 countries around the world, 8 of those in Africa region, which are implementing what we call comprehensive refugee response framework, and that means that we are including the refugees in the community from the onset of the emergency. We are providing support not only for the refugees but also the host communities. We are providing better livelihoods, and also including other actors, not only the humanitarian actors, but development, private sector, civil society into the equation.
You're still saying the problem is so big that it calls for a fresh response, and there's a new blueprint. Outline that for us.
Exactly. This is the comprehensive refugee response framework is the new blueprint. Later this year, the UNHCR will be presenting the Global Compact on Refugees to the UN member states, and hopefully that will be adopted.
So you're talking about involving refugees in the planning of how to deal with refugees?
Well, it's extremely important to include refugees in all phases, from planning and implementation. But in this particular case, we want to include the refugees in our societies, because what we see that sometimes we provide separate services for refugees and separate services for the host communities.
Yeah.
Now is include the refugees into the communities, provide them access to the education, health, the basic services, and also support the local structures in these communities.
And what about the fears in host nations? You know, people saying we're going to lose our Western culture, our democratic culture, if we're flooded in from people from different cultures. Is part of the strategy dealing with those deep-seated fears in some cases?
Often these fears are based on ignorance. You know, we're afraid of the unknown. We don't know any refugee or asylum seekers ourselves, and we're very vulnerable of the information that we receive from whatever channel. In these particular cases, you know, the best is just, you know, get to know who are the refugees and who are the asylum seekers. And what we find out often is that these are people just like you and me. They have very similar hopeless dreams, and once we get to know them, we definitely have a different views.
Final question. A lot of people would say this is about stability in Africa, a lot of volatile regions. What do you think the role of a country like South Africa is?
Well, I think in South Africa in particular, I mean, South Africa is generously hosting 280,000 refugees and asylum seekers, and it has the very advanced legislation. You know, the refugees have right to work, they have freedom of movement, they have access to the basic services, and so it's in the many way in the refugee protection is modeled in the region and beyond.
Okay, so good to know. We just keep continuing as we have been in the past, basically.
It's always work in progress.
All right, thank you very much for your time. Markku Aikomus, UNHCR, the UN's Refugee Agency spokesperson.